The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as President Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the latest intelligence reports. For several weeks now, something had been bothering him, something that didn't quite add up. The numbers on his desk told a story that made his veteran instincts tingle with unease. Minister Ouedraogo, he called to his chief of staff, who was organizing documents nearby. Come here and look at these immigration figures. The elderly, Minister approached, adjusting his glasses as he peered at the paperwork. What concerns you, Mr. President? These visitor numbers, Traoré pointed with his pen. In the past month alone, we've had a 400% increase in foreign visitors. That's not normal, especially during our dry season when tourism typically drops. Minister Ouedraogo frowned as he studied the data. You're right, sir. And look at this. Most of them are staying for extended periods. Some have been here for weeks. President Traoré stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the capital. The bustling streets of Ouagadougou seemed normal enough, but he knew that appearances could be deceiving. In his years of military service before entering politics, he had learned to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. I've been watching. The hotels, he continued, the Lyco, the Splendid, the Villa Rose, they're all reporting unusual booking patterns. Groups of foreigners checking in separately but meeting together. Business meetings at odd hours. Phone calls in languages our staff don't recognize. What kind of business could require such secrecy? The minister asked. That's exactly what. I intend to find out, Traoré replied, his voice carrying the firm resolve that had made him a respected leader. Schedule a meeting with General Diallo and the intelligence chiefs. I want to know everything about these visitors, who they are, where they're from, and most importantly, what they want in Burkina Faso. Later that afternoon, the presidential conference room filled with the country's top security officials. General Diallo, a battle-hardened veteran with graying temples, sat across from Colonel Sawadogo, head of national intelligence. Minister of Defense Kabore completed the inner circle of advisors. Gentlemen, President Traoré began, spreading the visitor reports across the mahogany table. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Our country is experiencing an unprecedented influx of foreign visitors, and I don't believe it's coincidental. Colonel Sawadogo spoke first. Sir, we've been monitoring some unusual activities. Foreign nationals conducting what they claim are geological surveys in remote areas. Others inquiring about mining permits and land acquisition laws. There's definitely coordination happening. Coordination suggests organization, General Diallo added. In my experience, when foreigners coordinate secretly in our territory, it's rarely for legitimate purposes. Defense Minister Kabore nodded, gravely. We've also noticed increased satellite surveillance over certain regions. Our communications intercept team has detected encrypted transmissions that don't match typical business or diplomatic patterns. President Traoré absorbed this information, his expression growing more serious. What about our opposition leaders? Any connections to these activities? The room fell silent for a moment before Colonel Sawadogo spoke carefully. Sir, we've observed several meetings between prominent opposition figures and unknown foreign nationals. The meetings occur in private residences, away from public view. That's treason if they're conducting state business without government authorization, General Diallo stated bluntly. We need proof before making such accusations, President Traoré cautioned. But we also can't ignore the signs. I'm authorizing enhanced surveillance on all foreign visitors. Every person entering our borders gets a thorough background check. Every meeting gets monitored. Every communication gets intercepted if possible. What about diplomatic immunity? Minister Kabore asked. Diplomatic immunity doesn't extend to activities that threaten national security, the president replied, firmly. If someone is using diplomatic cover to conduct unauthorized operations, we have every right to investigate. The meeting continued for 2 hours as they developed their surveillance strategy. Unknown to President Traoré and his team, the truth was far more extraordinary than any of them could have imagined. In a small village called Tenkodogo, about 180 kilometers southeast of Ouagadougou, an old farmer named Burema had been keeping a secret that would change the fate of Burkina Faso forever. 3 months earlier, while digging a new well for his family, he had struck something unusual. Not water, but a glittering yellow vein that ran deep into the earth. Burema was no fool. He had lived through decades of foreign exploitation of African resources. He knew that what he had found was gold, and not just any gold. This appeared to be part of a massive deposit that stretched far beyond his small plot of land. But instead of reporting it to the government as required by law, he had made a fateful decision to share his discovery with his nephew, Amadou, who worked for an opposition political party. Amadou had connections in the opposition movement, and he saw an opportunity for personal enrichment. Rather than inform President Traoré's government about this potential windfall for the nation, he began discreetly sharing information with foreign contacts who had promised him substantial payments for intelligence about Burkina Faso's natural resources. "Uncle," Amadou had told Burema during one of their clandestine meetings, "the government will take everything and give us nothing. These foreign companies, they understand business. They'll make us rich." What neither Burema nor Amadou fully understood was the scale of their discovery. Geological surveys conducted secretly by foreign experts revealed that the gold deposit was potentially one of the largest ever found in West Africa. Conservative estimates suggested it could contain gold worth over $2 billion, possibly much more. The foreign mining companies that had learned of the discovery through Amadou's network moved quickly and quietly. They sent teams of geologists, mining engineers, and security specialists to assess the site and develop extraction plans. They established shell companies, bribed local officials, and began preparing for what they assumed would be a straightforward resource grab. Their mistake was underestimating President Ibrahim Traoré. Meanwhile, the increased foreign activity hadn't gone unnoticed by ordinary citizens. In Tenkodogo, villagers began talking about the strange men who visited at odd hours, the expensive vehicles parked near Burema's property, and the unusual amount of digging and surveying happening around the area. An elderly woman named Fatimata, who sold vegetables in the local market, became suspicious when she noticed foreign men paying premium prices for simple supplies while asking detailed questions about local land ownership and traditional mining practices. "Something is not right," she told her daughter Aisha, who worked as a clerk in the regional government office. "These men, they ask too many questions and they have too much money for simple traders." Aisha, being loyal to her country and suspicious of the secretive behavior, decided to report her mother's observations to the authorities. Her report made its way up the chain of command and eventually reached Colonel Sawadogo's intelligence team. This was the beginning of the unraveling of the conspiracy. Armed with Aisha's tip and growing evidence of coordinated foreign activity, President Traoré authorized Operation Clean Sweep, a comprehensive investigation into all suspicious foreign nationals in the country. The operation would prove to be one of the most important decisions of his presidency. General Diallo personally oversaw the enhanced security measures. "Every hotel, every guest house, every private residence hosting foreigners will be monitored," he instructed his commanders. "We need to understand what's happening in our own country." The first breakthrough came when security forces conducted a routine inspection at a mid-range hotel in Ouagadougou. Among the guests was a man claiming to be an agricultural equipment salesman from South Africa. His papers appeared legitimate, but something about his behavior struck Captain Yameogo, the lead investigating officer, as suspicious. "Why does an agricultural equipment salesman have geological survey maps in his luggage?" Captain Yameogo asked his team as they examined the man's belongings in his hotel room. The maps were detailed topographical surveys of the Tenkodogo region, marked with symbols that clearly indicated mineral deposits. More damning was a series of photographs on the man's phone showing underground rock formations with distinct golden veins. "This isn't farming equipment research," Sergeant Kinda observed. "This looks like mining reconnaissance." When confronted, the South African initially maintained his cover story. But under questioning, his story began to fall apart. He couldn't name basic agricultural equipment models, didn't know current crop prices, and most tellingly, had no business contacts in Burkina Faso's actual agricultural sector. After 6 hours of interrogation, he finally broke. "Look, I'm just doing a job," he admitted, sweat beading on his forehead. "I was hired to take pictures and make measurements. They told me it was for an investment evaluation." "Who hired you?" Captain Yameogo pressed. "A company called Continental Resources. They have offices in Johannesburg and London. They specialize in mineral exploration in Africa." "What were you evaluating?" The man hesitated, then pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "There," he said, showing them a photograph that made everyone in the room gasp. The image showed a massive, golden vein running through an underground cavern, so large and pure that it seemed almost unreal. The geological formation suggested a deposit of extraordinary size and value. "Where was this taken?" Captain Yameogo demanded. "Near a village called Tenkodogo. There's more down there than anyone imagines." Within hours, this information was in President Traoré's hands. As he stared at the photograph, he felt a mixture of excitement and fury. Excitement at the potential wealth this could bring to his people, and fury at the betrayal it represented. "How long has this been going on without our knowledge?" he asked Colonel Sawadogo. "Based on our timeline analysis, sir, at least 3 months, possibly longer. The foreign teams have been conducting detailed surveys and preparing extraction plans." "And our own people are involved?" Colonel Sawadogo nodded grimly. "The trail leads back to several opposition figures who appear to have been feeding information to foreign mining interests." President Traoré stood in silence for several minutes, processing the implications. Finally, he spoke with quiet determination. "Gentlemen, what we're looking at could be the largest gold discovery in our nation's history. This could transform Burkina Faso, lift our people out of poverty, fund schools and hospitals, and secure our future for generations. But only if we act quickly and decisively to protect it from those who would steal it from us." The next phase of Operation Clean Sweep involved securing the actual gold site while continuing to investigate the full scope of the conspiracy. President Traoré knew that once word of their discovery got out, the pressure from foreign governments and corporations would become intense. At dawn on a humid Tuesday morning, a convoy of military vehicles made its way toward Tenkodogo. General Diallo rode in the lead vehicle, accompanied by a team of mining engineers, geologists, and security specialists. Their mission was to assess the gold deposit and establish a secure perimeter around it. The village of Tenkodogo was awakening as the convoy arrived. Curious villagers gathered as soldiers began setting up checkpoints on the roads leading into the area. Many residents had never seen such a military presence in their quiet farming community. Village Chief Ousmane, a dignified man in his 70s, approached General Diallo as soon as the convoy stopped. "General, with respect, what brings the army to our peaceful village?" Chief Ousmane asked in the formal tone reserved for addressing high officials. General Diallo had prepared for this moment. The success of their operation would depend partly on winning the trust and cooperation of the local people. "Chief Ousmane, I come with news that will change your village forever. We have discovered that your land sits atop one of the largest gold deposits in Africa. This treasure belongs to the people of Burkina Faso, but there are foreign forces trying to steal it. We are here to protect what is rightfully yours." The chief's eyes widened as he absorbed this information. Around them, villagers who had been listening began to murmur with excitement and concern. "Gold?" an elderly woman called out. "Here in our village?" "Yes, grandmother," General Diallo replied respectfully. More gold than any of us could have imagined. But with such wealth comes great danger. Foreign companies and corrupt politicians have been meeting secretly, planning to take this gold without giving anything to our people. A young farmer named Ibrahim stepped forward. General, if this gold belongs to us, why do we need soldiers? Can't we just take it ourselves? General Diallo appreciated the young man's directness. Brother, this gold is worth billions of dollars. When word spreads, powerful forces will try to claim it. Some will use violence, others will use corruption, and still others will use legal tricks. Only by standing together with our government can we ensure that this wealth benefits all of Burkina Faso. As the soldiers established their security perimeter, the geological team began their assessment of the deposit. What they found exceeded even their optimistic estimates. Dr. Sankara, the lead geologist, emerged from the initial underground survey with an expression of amazement. General, he reported privately, this deposit is extraordinary. The gold content is exceptionally high, and the seam appears to extend much deeper than we initially thought. We're looking at potentially $3–4 billion in recoverable gold, possibly more. How long to extract it safely? General Diallo asked. If we do it right, maintaining safety standards and environmental protection, we're looking at an operation that could take 2 to 3 years to fully exploit, but the revenue stream would be substantial throughout that period. That evening, General Diallo called President Traoré with his report. Mr. President, I can confirm that we are dealing with one of the largest gold deposits ever discovered in West Africa. The site is now secure, but we've also uncovered evidence of extensive foreign surveillance and preparation for unauthorized extraction. What kind of evidence? President Traoré asked. Hidden surveillance equipment, buried cables leading to communication devices, and excavation sites that were clearly prepared by professional mining teams. Sir, if we had not acted when we did, this gold would have been stolen within months. President Traoré felt a chill at how close they had come to losing their national treasure. General, I want that site protected as if it were our nuclear arsenal. No one gets near it without authorization from the highest levels. Understood. Sir, we've also identified the local individuals who were cooperating with the foreign teams. They include the farmer who discovered the gold, his nephew who works for the opposition, and several other community members who were recruited as informants. Handle them carefully, President Traoré advised. Some may have been deceived rather than truly treacherous. We need to understand their motivations and see if they can be turned into allies rather than enemies. As security forces continued their investigation, the full scope of the opposition's betrayal became clear. Phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage revealed a coordinated effort by several prominent opposition leaders to facilitate foreign exploitation of Burkina Faso's newly discovered gold reserves. The evidence was damning. Opposition leader Moussa Konate had received payments totaling over $500,000 from foreign mining companies in exchange for geological survey data and political intelligence. Another opposition figure, Dr. Fatimata Zerbo, had used her connections in the legal community to research mining laws and identify loopholes that foreign companies could exploit. Most troubling was the involvement of Sergeant Major Abdoulaye Sawadogo, a military officer who had been providing the foreign teams with detailed information about government security protocols and military deployments in the region. Colonel Sawadogo, no relation to the traitorous Sergeant Major, presented the evidence to President Traoré in a secure briefing room at the presidential palace. Sir, we have documented proof that at least 6 high-ranking opposition members have been actively working with foreign mining companies to facilitate the unauthorized extraction of gold from our territory. President Traoré studied the photographs. Financial records and intercepts spread across the table. Each piece of evidence represented another layer of betrayal that cut deep into his sense of national loyalty. These people took oaths to serve Burkina Faso, he said quietly. They were elected by our citizens to represent their interests. Instead, they chose to sell out their own country for personal profit. What are your orders regarding their arrest? Sir, Colonel Sawadogo asked. President Traoré considered this carefully. Arresting prominent opposition figures would be seen as politically motivated by some, but the evidence of treason was overwhelming. We'll arrest them, but we'll do it properly. Full transparency, clear evidence presented publicly, and due process. Followed completely. The people of Burkina Faso need to understand exactly how their elected officials betrayed them. The arrests began at dawn on Thursday morning. Moussa Konate was taken into custody at his residence in Ouagadougou's wealthy Koulouba district. Dr. Fatimata Zerbo was arrested at her law office. Sergeant Major Sawadogo was detained at his military barracks. Each arrest was accompanied by the seizure of documents, computers, and financial records that further detailed the scope of the conspiracy. The most dramatic arrest occurred when security forces surrounded a safe house in Bobo Dioulasso, where several opposition figures were meeting with foreign representatives. The meeting was intended to finalize plans for the gold extraction, but instead became the scene of the conspiracy's final exposure. As news of the arrests spread, public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly supportive of President Traoré's actions. Citizens who had long suspected corruption in the opposition ranks felt vindicated, while others expressed shock at the scale of the betrayal. Fatimata, the vegetable seller whose initial tip had helped uncover the conspiracy, told a local radio station, "I knew something was wrong when these foreigners started asking too many questions. Thank God our president was watching and protecting us." However, not all reaction was positive. Some opposition supporters claimed the arrests were politically motivated and called for international intervention. Foreign governments and organizations that had been working with the arrested officials began pressuring Burkina Faso's government to release the prisoners. President Traoré addressed these concerns in a televised speech to the nation. "My fellow citizens, I understand that some question the timing and motivation of these arrests. But I ask you to look at the evidence. These individuals were not engaged in legitimate political opposition. They were actively working to steal our national wealth and hand it over to foreign corporations." He held up photographs of the gold deposit and documents showing the foreign companies' extraction plans. This gold could build thousands of schools, hundreds of hospitals, and transform our nation's future. But only if we protect it from those who would steal it. The evidence of treason is clear and undeniable. As word of Burkina Faso's gold discovery and the arrests of opposition figures spread internationally, President Traoré found himself facing unprecedented pressure from foreign governments and multinational corporations. The first diplomatic salvo came in the form of a strongly worded statement from the European Union expressing concern about the arrest of political opposition figures and calling for their immediate release. Similar statements followed from the United States, Canada, and several European nations. Behind these public statements, however, was a coordinated campaign by the mining companies that had been exposed in the conspiracy. Continental Resources, the South African company at the center of the plot, had connections to political leaders and business interests across multiple continents. President Traoré was not surprised by the international pressure, but he was determined not to let it influence his decisions about Burkina Faso's sovereign rights. "Let me be clear," he told his cabinet during an emergency meeting. "No foreign government has the right to dictate how we handle treason committed against our own country. If these same nations were facing the theft of billions of dollars in natural resources, they would respond far more harshly than we have." Foreign Minister Djibril Bassolé, who had been fielding angry calls from ambassadors all morning, agreed with the president's stance, but warned about the practical consequences. "Sir, they're threatening economic sanctions, suspension of development aid, and exclusion from international trade agreements. The pressure will be significant." "Minister Bassolé," President Traoré replied, "what good is international aid if we allow foreigners to steal resources worth billions? What value are trade agreements that require us to surrender our sovereignty? We must be prepared to stand alone, if necessary. The international pressure campaign intensified over the following weeks. Western media outlets published critical articles questioning President Traoré's democratic credentials and suggesting that the gold discovery was being used as a pretext for authoritarianism. More concerning were intelligence reports suggesting that some foreign governments were considering more direct intervention. Satellite imagery showed unusual military activity at bases in neighboring countries, and there were reports of mercenary companies being contracted for operations in West Africa. General Diallo briefed President Traoré on these developments with evident concern. "Sir, we're detecting increased military surveillance of our borders and communications intercepts, suggesting that some external parties are considering destabilization operations." "You mean they would actually consider military intervention over this gold?" President Traoré asked. "History shows us that foreign powers have intervened in Africa for far less valuable resources," General Diallo replied grimly. "We need to be prepared for any scenario." In response to these threats, President Traoré made a decision that would define his presidency. He would seek support from other African nations and non-Western allies rather than submit to foreign pressure. "General," he instructed, "reach out to our allies in Mali, Niger, and Ghana. Tell them what we're facing and ask for their support. Also, contact the African Union and ECOWAS. If we're going to protect African resources for African people, we need African unity." The response was encouraging. Several West African leaders expressed private support for Burkina Faso's position, even if they couldn't offer it publicly due to their own relationships with Western nations. More importantly, countries like China, Russia, and India indicated their willingness to provide alternative partnerships that would not require Burkina Faso to surrender control of its gold resources. While dealing with international pressure, President Traoré never lost sight of his primary responsibility, ensuring that the gold discovery benefited the people of Burkina Faso. He established a special committee to develop a comprehensive plan for gold extraction and revenue distribution that would serve as a model for resource management in Africa. The committee included economists, engineers, traditional chiefs, religious leaders, and representatives from various communities across the country. Their mandate was to create a system that would maximize benefits for ordinary citizens while maintaining national control of the resource. Dr. Aminata Traoré, no relation to the president, a respected economist who had served as Mali's Minister of Culture, was brought in to chair the committee. "Mr. President," she said during their first meeting, "this is an opportunity to show the world that African nations can manage their own resources responsibly and for the benefit of their own people. But it will require unprecedented transparency and accountability." President Traoré agreed completely. "Dr. Traoré, I want every citizen of Burkina Faso to know exactly how much gold we extract, how much revenue it generates, and how that money is spent. This will not be another case of resource wealth disappearing into the pockets of politicians and foreign corporations." The committee worked for 6 weeks to develop their comprehensive plan. Their recommendations were revolutionary by African standards. First, all gold extraction would be managed by a new state-owned enterprise with full transparency requirements. Every transaction would be published publicly, and independent auditors would verify all financial records. Second, a specific percentage of gold revenues would be allocated to each major area of national development. Education, 25%. Healthcare, 20%. Infrastructure, 20%. Agricultural development, 15%. Emergency reserves, 10%. And local community development, 10%. Third, every citizen of Burkina Faso would receive an annual dividend payment from the gold revenues, ensuring that ordinary people directly benefited from their national wealth. Fourth, strict environmental and labor standards would be enforced, with international monitoring to ensure responsible extraction practices. When the plan was announced publicly, It generated enormous enthusiasm among ordinary citizens and significant concern among traditional political and business elites who had expected to profit personally from the gold discovery. Amadou Ouedraogo, a teacher in Ouagadougou, expressed the sentiment of many citizens when he told a local radio station. Finally, we have a leader who understands that our natural resources belong to all of us, not just the wealthy and powerful. However, implementing the plan would prove challenging. The technical aspects of gold extraction required expertise and equipment that Burkina Faso did not possess domestically. The committee had to navigate the complex task of acquiring necessary foreign technology and expertise without surrendering control to foreign corporations. President Traoré addressed this challenge by pursuing partnerships with countries that had experience in maintaining state control over natural resources. We will learn from the successes and failures of other nations, he announced. Norway's management of oil resources, Botswana's diamond policies, and Chile's copper industry all offer lessons for how we can maintain national control while accessing global markets. 6 months after the initial discovery, Burkina Faso's first official gold extraction began under the new national framework. President Traoré personally attended the ceremony at the Tenkodogo site, which had been transformed from a quiet farming village into a secure mining operation. The ceremony was attended by traditional chiefs, government officials, international observers, and hundreds of local residents who had been relocated to new housing built with advance payments from expected gold revenues. Chief Ousmane, now recognized as the traditional guardian of the gold site, spoke first. Our ancestors always told us that this land was special, that it held treasures waiting for the right time to emerge. Today we see that they were right. But more importantly, we see that these treasures will benefit all our people, not just a few. President Traoré's speech emphasized the historic significance of the moment. Today, Burkina Faso joins the small group of nations that have successfully maintained control over their natural resources for the benefit of their own people. This gold will not make foreign shareholders rich. It will build schools for our children, hospitals for our families, and roads for our communities. As the first ceremonial bucket of gold-bearing ore was extracted, cheers erupted from the crowd. But President Traoré knew that this celebration was premature. The real challenges were just beginning. The international mining companies that had been excluded from the project began a coordinated campaign to undermine Burkina Faso's independent extraction efforts. They spread rumors about technical incompetence, environmental damage, and financial mismanagement. More seriously, they began lobbying their home governments to impose economic sanctions on Burkina Faso and to support opposition groups that promised to reverse President Traoré's policies if they came to power. Within weeks of the first extraction, Burkina Faso's gold purchasing agreements with traditional Western buyers were mysteriously canceled. European refineries that had previously expressed interest in purchasing Burkinabe gold suddenly cited technical concerns and regulatory issues. Finance Minister Rosine Coulibaly briefed President Traoré on the situation. "Sir, we're being systematically excluded from traditional gold markets. The companies we exposed are using their influence to create artificial barriers to our gold sales. What are our alternatives?" President Traoré asked. "We've received offers from Chinese, Indian, and Middle Eastern buyers. The prices they're offering are actually higher than what we would have received in European markets, but it means completely restructuring our export relationships." President Traoré saw this as an opportunity rather than a setback. "Minister Coulibaly, perhaps it's time for Burkina Faso to develop new relationships that aren't based on the colonial patterns of the past. If Asian and Middle Eastern buyers offer better terms and more respect for our sovereignty, then that's where our gold should go." This decision further intensified Western pressure on Burkina Faso, but it also opened new possibilities for South-South cooperation that had previously been difficult to imagine. As President Traoré's gold policies began showing concrete results, new schools opening, healthcare centers being built, and infrastructure projects beginning, the remaining opposition forces realized that their credibility was rapidly eroding. Desperate to regain political relevance, they began a campaign of sabotage and disinformation. The first sign of trouble came when explosions damaged equipment at the Tenkodogo site. Although no one was injured, the message was clear. There were still forces within Burkina Faso willing to damage their own country's interests to serve foreign masters. Colonel Sawadogo's investigation revealed that the sabotage had been carried out by a network of opposition supporters who had been trained and equipped by foreign intelligence operatives. "Sir," he reported to President Traoré, "we've identified at least 20 individuals involved in this sabotage network. Some are former military personnel, others are unemployed youth who were recruited with promises of money and jobs abroad." "What's driving them?" President Traoré asked. "Why would Burkinabe citizens attack their own country's development?" "A combination of factors, sir. Some genuinely believe the opposition propaganda that you're becoming a dictator. Others are simply desperate for income and were offered substantial payments. But the leadership is clearly taking orders from foreign handlers." The sabotage campaign escalated over the following months. In addition to attacks on mining equipment, opposition forces began targeting the new schools and healthcare centers being built with gold revenues. The attack that most outraged ordinary citizens occurred when saboteurs destroyed a nearly completed elementary school in a rural village outside Bobo Dioulasso. The school would have served over 300 children, many of whom had never had access to formal education. Village elder Mama Sanogo spoke for many when she told a government delegation, "These people who destroy schools for children, they are not opposition politicians. They are enemies of our people. They want to keep us poor and ignorant so that foreigners can continue to exploit us." Public opinion turned decisively against the opposition saboteurs, but President Traoré knew that military action alone could not solve the problem. He needed to address the underlying issues that made some citizens vulnerable to foreign manipulation. "We need to accelerate our development programs," he told his cabinet. "Every month that people wait for better schools, better health care, and better opportunities is another month that our enemies can exploit their frustration." This decision led to the implementation of emergency development programs funded by gold revenues. Instead of the gradual planned rollout originally envisioned, President Traoré authorized crash programs to build infrastructure and provide services as quickly as possible. The results were dramatic. Within 6 months, over 50 new schools were opened across the country. Mobile healthcare clinics began serving remote areas that had never had medical services. Road construction projects connected isolated communities to regional markets. Most importantly, the annual Citizen Dividend Program began making direct payments to every Burkinabe adult. While the amounts were modest, equivalent to about 2 months of minimum wage income, they represented something unprecedented in African politics. Ordinary citizens directly benefiting from their country's natural resource wealth. As Burkina Faso's successful management of its gold resources became internationally recognized, President Traoré found himself emerging as a leader in the growing movement for African resource sovereignty. The African Union invited him to present his gold management model at their annual summit, where other African leaders expressed strong interest in adapting similar approaches for their own countries. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, known for his own successful resource management policies, told President Traoré privately, "What you've accomplished in Burkina Faso proves that African nations can compete with anyone when we maintain control of our own resources and manage them competently." This recognition led to formal partnerships, with several other African countries interested in developing independent resource extraction capabilities. Ghana, Mali, and Tanzania all signed cooperation agreements with Burkina Faso to share expertise and coordinate policies. More significantly, major non-Western powers began viewing Burkina Faso as a model for South-South cooperation. China offered to provide technical expertise and equipment for gold extraction in exchange for long-term supply agreements at market prices. India proposed similar arrangements, while Russia offered security cooperation to help protect Burkina Faso's resource. Installations from external threats. These partnerships allowed Burkina Faso to bypass the Western economic sanctions and market exclusions that had been imposed in response to President Traoré's policies. Brazilian mining company Vale, which had experience working with state-controlled resource extraction, signed a major technical assistance agreement that provided Burkina Faso with access to cutting-edge extraction technology without requiring foreign ownership of the gold deposits. "This is what true partnership looks like," President Traoré explained in a televised address. "We maintain full control of our resources, but we access the best technology and expertise from around the world. Everyone benefits, but no one is exploited." 2 years after the initial gold discovery, Burkina Faso had been transformed. The statistics were impressive. Literacy rates had increased by 40%, child mortality had decreased by 25%, and GDP per capita had doubled. More importantly, these improvements were broadly distributed across the population rather than concentrated among urban elites. However, success brought new challenges. The rapid influx of gold revenues had created inflationary pressures in some sectors of the economy. The construction boom had driven up costs for building materials and skilled labor. Some regions benefited more than others from the development programs, creating regional tensions. Most challenging was the management of expectations. As living standards improved, citizens' demands for even better services and infrastructure increased accordingly. President Traoré found himself in the paradoxical situation of being criticized for not developing fast enough, despite achieving unprecedented development success. Economic advisor Dr. Rasmane Ouedraogo briefed President Traoré on these challenges. "Sir, we're experiencing what economists call the resource curse in reverse. Instead of resource wealth creating corruption and inequality, it's creating rising expectations and political pressure for even faster development." "Is that necessarily bad?" President Traoré asked. "Not bad, sir, but challenging. We need to manage expectations while maintaining the pace of development. If we promise too much or develop too quickly, we risk creating economic imbalances that could undermine our progress." This led to the establishment of long-term planning committees that focused on sustainable development rather than rapid expansion. The goal was to ensure that Burkina Faso's gold wealth would benefit future generations, not just the current population. President Traoré also recognized the need to diversify the economy beyond gold mining. Using gold revenues to invest in education, technology, and manufacturing, his government began developing other sectors that could sustain economic growth even after the gold deposits were eventually exhausted. As President Traoré entered his third year of managing the gold discovery, he began to reflect on the broader implications of what Burkina Faso had accomplished. The success had attracted international attention not just as an economic model, but as a demonstration of what was possible when African leaders prioritized their people's welfare over personal enrichment or foreign approval. The transformation was visible everywhere. In Ouagadougou, new university buildings rose alongside modern hospitals equipped with the latest medical technology. In rural areas, solar-powered schools connected remote villages to global educational resources through satellite internet. The road network that had been a national embarrassment was now among the best in West Africa. But perhaps most importantly, the psychological transformation of the Burkinabe people was profound. Citizens who had grown up expecting nothing from their government now took pride in their country's achievements and demanded continued progress. Young people who might have sought opportunities abroad now saw futures for themselves at home. Aminata Kabore, a 19-year-old student at the new National Science and Technology University built with gold revenues, exemplified this change. "Before the gold discovery, my dream was to finish school and try to emigrate to Europe or America. Now I want to stay and help build my country. We're proving that Africans can manage our own resources and create prosperity for ourselves. However, President Traoré knew that sustaining this progress would require continued vigilance against the forces that had initially tried to steal Burkina Faso's gold wealth. Intelligence reports indicated that foreign mining companies and their government allies had not abandoned their goals. They had simply shifted to longer-term strategies designed to eventually regain control of the gold deposits. They're playing a waiting game, Colonel Sawadogo briefed the president. They expect that eventually, either you'll leave office or economic pressures will force Burkina Faso to accept foreign partnerships on unfavorable terms. Then we need to make our success irreversible, President Traoré replied. The institutions we've built, the legal frameworks we've established, the economic diversification we've achieved, all of this needs to be so deeply embedded in our national life that no future leader can easily undo it. This led to a comprehensive constitutional reform process that would legally enshrine the principles of resource sovereignty and citizen ownership of natural wealth. The reforms required that any future changes to resource management policies be approved by direct popular referendum, making it nearly impossible for corrupt leaders to secretly sell out the country's interests. The constitutional reforms also established independent oversight institutions with the power to monitor resource extraction, verify revenue distribution, and prosecute corruption. These institutions were given constitutional protection that made them difficult for future governments to manipulate or eliminate. Burkina Faso's success began to inspire similar movements across Africa. In neighboring Mali, opposition leaders demanded to know why their country's gold was controlled by foreign companies while ordinary Malians remained impoverished. In Niger, uranium workers organized strikes demanding that more revenue from uranium exports be invested in local development. The phenomenon, dubbed the Burkina Faso model by international observers, represented a fundamental challenge to the post-colonial resource extraction system that had kept African countries poor while making foreign corporations wealthy. President Traoré was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly, where he articulated a vision that resonated far beyond Africa. Distinguished delegates, the world has grown accustomed to a system where the poorest countries provide raw materials to the richest countries, receiving minimal compensation while others profit enormously from their natural wealth. Burkina Faso's experience proves that this system is not inevitable. It is a choice, and we can choose differently. His speech was interrupted by sustained applause from delegations representing developing countries around the world, but it also generated intense opposition from representatives of countries and corporations that benefited from the existing system. The French delegation walked out during his speech, and the U.S. representative issued a statement afterward criticizing resource nationalism and warning about the dangers of isolating developing countries from global markets. President Traoré's response was measured but firm. We are not isolating ourselves from global markets. We are participating in them as equals rather than as victims. Any country or company that offers fair partnerships based on mutual respect is welcome in Burkina Faso. But the era of exploitation disguised as partnership is over. As Burkina Faso's success became undeniable, the opposition to President Traoré's policies evolved into more sophisticated and dangerous forms. Intelligence services detected attempts to infiltrate key institutions, cyber attacks on government communication systems, and efforts to spread ethnic and religious divisions within the country. Most concerning was evidence of plans to support separatist movements in regions of the country with significant natural resources. Foreign intelligence agencies had begun contacts with marginal political figures who might be willing to lead breakaway movements in exchange for promises of international recognition and financial support. General Diallo presented President Traoré with intercepted communications that revealed the scope of these threats. "Sir, They're trying to create artificial conflicts between different ethnic groups, hoping to destabilize the country and create pretexts for international intervention. They're also supporting criminal networks that could disrupt our mining operations and transportation infrastructure. President Traoré recognized that military responses alone would be insufficient to address these threats. The real defense against destabilization would be the continued loyalty and unity of the Burkinabe people, which could only be maintained through continued progress in improving their lives. "General, our best defense is success," he said. "Every school we build, every clinic we open, every road we repair makes it harder for our enemies to convince our people that they would be better off under foreign control." This understanding led to an acceleration of community development programs specifically targeted at regions and groups that might be vulnerable to foreign manipulation. Special attention was paid to ensuring that all ethnic and religious communities felt they were benefiting from the country's new prosperity. Traditional and religious leaders were brought into the resource management process as advisors and monitors, giving them direct stakes in the success of the gold extraction programs. Youth employment programs were expanded to ensure that young people had economic opportunities that made them less susceptible to recruitment by criminal or extremist networks. 4 years after the gold discovery, the remaining opposition forces and their foreign allies made one last desperate attempt to regain control of Burkina Faso's resources. The plan was sophisticated and multi-layered, involving simultaneous political, economic, and military pressure designed to force President Traoré to accept foreign partnerships on unfavorable terms. The political component involved a campaign to paint President Traoré as an increasingly authoritarian leader who was isolating Burkina Faso from the international community. Opposition figures who had fled the country after their involvement in the original conspiracy were given platforms in international media to claim that they were being persecuted for their political beliefs rather than prosecuted for treason. The economic component involved coordinated attempts to disrupt Burkina Faso's new trading relationships. Shipping companies were pressured to refuse to transport Burkinabe gold. Financial institutions were discouraged from processing payments, and insurance companies were lobbied to deny coverage for Burkina Faso's mining operations. Most dangerously, the military component involved support for armed groups that began launching attacks on mining installations and infrastructure projects. These groups claimed to be fighting for regional autonomy or religious freedom, but intelligence analysis revealed they were being armed, trained, and funded by the same foreign networks that had originally tried to steal the gold. The crisis came to a head when armed militants attacked a convoy transporting gold from the Tenkodogo site to the refinery in Ouagadougou. 3 security guards were killed, and several $1 million worth of gold was seized. The attack was immediately claimed by a previously unknown group, calling itself the Liberation Front of Southern Burkina Faso, which demanded that the gold revenues be distributed directly to local communities rather than managed by the national government. President Traoré knew that this was a crucial test of his government's ability to protect Burkina Faso's sovereignty and resources. His response would determine whether the country's experiment in independent resource management would survive or collapse under foreign pressure. President Traoré's response to the armed attacks demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made his resource management policies successful. Instead of simply increasing military pressure, he launched a comprehensive counter-campaign that addressed the political, economic, and security dimensions of the threat simultaneously. On the security front, he authorized targeted military operations against the armed groups while being careful to minimize civilian casualties and respect human rights. The operations were conducted with full transparency, including international observers, to prevent critics from claiming that he was using security concerns as a pretext for authoritarian actions. More importantly, he launched a massive public information campaign that exposed the foreign connections and funding sources of the armed groups. Intercepted communications were released, showing how the Liberation Front was actually receiving orders and payments from foreign mining companies and intelligence services. The revelation that the attacks were foreign-sponsored rather than genuine expressions of local grievances destroyed any popular support the militants might have had. Village leaders in the affected regions publicly denounced the groups and offered their full cooperation to government security forces. On the economic front, President Traoré turned the attempted disruption of Burkina Faso's trade relationships into an opportunity to develop even more independent economic partnerships. When Western shipping companies refused to transport Burkinabe, gold Chinese and Indian companies eagerly filled the gap. When European financial institutions tried to block payments, Islamic banking networks and Russian financial services provided alternatives. Within 6 months, Burkina Faso had developed a completely independent network of economic relationships that made it immune to the economic pressure that had been applied. More importantly, many of these new relationships offered better terms than the previous arrangements with Western companies. The political response was perhaps most crucial. President Traoré used the foreign attacks on Burkina Faso to rally continental African support for resource sovereignty. The African Union passed a resolution condemning external interference in the sovereign management of African natural resources and established a mutual defense framework for countries facing economic or military pressure over their resource policies. This continental solidarity made it impossible for foreign powers to isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically. Instead of being portrayed as an isolated rogue state, Burkina Faso became the leading example of a new model of African independence that other countries wanted to emulate rather than oppose. 5 years after the discovery of gold in Tenkodogo, Burkina Faso had become unrecognizable. What had been one of the world's poorest countries was now a middle-income nation with rapidly improving living standards and growing international influence. The statistics told an incredible story. GDP per capita had increased by 400%. Literacy rates had risen to over 80%. Child mortality had fallen to levels comparable to developed countries, and life expectancy had increased by over 10 years. But numbers alone couldn't capture the transformation in hope and dignity that had occurred. International. Visitors who remembered the old Burkina Faso were amazed by what they found. Modern cities with reliable electricity and clean water, rural areas connected by good roads and telecommunications, schools and universities filled with confident young people preparing for careers in their own country rather than planning to emigrate. Dr. James Morrison, a World Bank economist who had worked in Burkina Faso before the gold discovery, wrote in his report, "The Burkina Faso transformation represents one of the most successful examples of resource-led development in modern history. More importantly, it demonstrates that African countries can achieve rapid development when they maintain control of their natural resources and prioritize the welfare of their own people over the profits of foreign corporations." But President Traoré knew that the ultimate measure of success would be sustainability. Could the institutions, policies, and social changes he had implemented survive beyond his own tenure in office? Would future leaders maintain the principles of resource, sovereignty, and equitable development that had made Burkina Faso's success possible? To address these concerns, he spent his final years in office focused on institutionalizing the changes that had been made. The constitutional reforms were ratified by overwhelming popular vote. Independent oversight institutions were staffed with competent professionals and given the resources they needed to function effectively. Civil society organizations were strengthened and given formal roles in monitoring government performance. Most importantly, he invested heavily in education and civic engagement to ensure that future generations of Burkinabe citizens would understand their rights and have the knowledge and skills needed to protect their country's independence and prosperity. The success of the Burkina Faso model inspired similar movements across Africa and the developing world. In Ghana, civil society organizations demanded renegotiation of gold mining contracts that gave most profits to foreign companies. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, mining workers organized to demand that cobalt and copper revenues be invested in local development rather than exported to benefit foreign shareholders. The model was adapted to different resources and circumstances. Tanzania applied similar principles to its natural gas reserves. Botswana, which had already achieved some success with diamond revenue management, refined its policies to ensure even more equitable distribution of benefits. Even countries outside Africa began examining whether they could apply some of Burkina Faso's innovations to their own resource sectors. The impact went beyond resource management. The demonstration that African countries could achieve rapid development through good governance and sovereignty. Focused policies challenged fundamental assumptions about development aid, foreign investment, and international relations. European and American development agencies that had spent decades promoting policies of privatization and foreign investment found themselves increasingly irrelevant as African countries pursued independent development strategies based on the Burkina Faso example. What President Traoré accomplished, wrote Professor Akinwumi Adesina, former president of the African Development Bank, was to prove that Africa doesn't need charity. We need justice. We need fair prices for our resources, control over our own development policies, and leaders who serve their people rather than foreign interests. 10 years after the discovery of gold in Tenkodogo, Ibrahim Traoré stepped down from the presidency, having served the maximum terms allowed under Burkina Faso's constitution. His chosen successor, Dr. Fatemata Ouedraogo, had been his Minister of Education and was committed to continuing the policies that had transformed the country. The transition was peaceful and democratic, demonstrating that Burkina Faso's success had been built on institutions rather than just individual leadership. The opposition, reconstituted with new leaders who accepted the principles of resource sovereignty, participated fully in the electoral process and even won several regional and local elections. President Traoré's farewell address to the nation was broadcast across Africa and watched by millions of people who had been inspired by Burkina Faso's example. My fellow citizens, 10 years ago, we faced a choice that every African country faces. Would we allow our resources to be stolen by foreign interests, or would we claim our birthright and build prosperity for our own people? We chose dignity over dependency and sovereignty over submission. The gold that was discovered beneath our soil was valuable, but it was not the most important treasure we found. The real treasure was our discovery that we Africans are capable of managing our own affairs, developing our own countries, and creating prosperity for our own people when we have leaders who serve the people rather than foreign masters. Today, Burkina Faso is no longer one of the world's poorest countries. Our children attend schools that rival any in the world. Our sick receive medical care that saves lives and restores health. Our farmers have roads to take their crops to market and technology to improve their yields. Our young people have opportunities to build careers and families in their own country rather than seeking better lives elsewhere. But our greatest achievement is not what we have built. It is what we have proven. We have proven that Africa can rise. We have proven that our resources can serve our people. We have proven that we need no one's permission to claim our rightful place in the world. The gold of Tenkodogo will eventually be exhausted, but the institutions we have built, the knowledge we have gained, and the confidence we have developed will last forever. Future generations of Burkinabe will face different challenges and discover different opportunities, but they will face them as free people in a sovereign nation that belongs to them. To our African brothers and sisters watching today, I say this: what we have accomplished in Burkina Faso is not unique or exceptional. Every African country has resources, natural resources, human resources, or geographic resources that can serve as the foundation for development and prosperity. What is required is not foreign aid or foreign investment, but African leadership, African unity, and African determination to control our own destiny. The age of Africa has begun. Let us build it together. As President Traoré concluded his speech and walked away from the podium for the last time as head of state, he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that he had kept faith with his people and his continent. The gold discovery had been a gift, but what his generation of leaders had done with that gift would be remembered as one of the turning points in African history. The story of Burkina Faso's hidden gold had begun with foreign conspiracies and domestic betrayal, but it had ended with transformation, dignity, and hope. It was, as President Traoré had said, only the beginning. The end.